The storm raged. Rain lashed against the old stone walls of Blackwood Manor. Wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the ancient oaks surrounding the house. Lightning split the sky, momentarily illuminating the manor in an eerie, skeletal glow. Each flash revealed the building's malevolent silhouette against the tempestuous backdrop, a stark reminder of its sinister reputation. Blackwood Manor stood isolated, perched precariously atop a windswept cliff. The sea roared angrily below, mirroring the storm above. The manor's windows, dark and vacant, stared out like the eyes of a watchful gargoyle. This was a place forgotten by time, shrouded in whispers of tragedy and steeped in an oppressive atmosphere of dread. Blackwood Manor had been empty for years, its only inhabitants the ghosts of its tortured past. Or so the legend went. Tonight, however, the silence of the manor was about to be shattered. A group of unsuspecting individuals were drawn to its forbidding gates, each with their own reasons for being there, each oblivious to the horror that awaited them. A rusted, wrought-iron gate, barely clinging to its hinges, marked the entrance to the grounds. The path, overgrown with weeds and shadowed by gnarled branches, snaked its way towards the imposing facade. The storm intensified, as if echoing the rising tension, the wind whipping the rain into stinging sheets. A van, headlights cutting through the gloom, slowly navigated the treacherous path. Inside, 4 figures huddled, their faces illuminated by the dashboard's pale glow. This was no ordinary group, no random collection of travellers seeking shelter from the storm. They were drawn here by a shared fascination, a morbid curiosity that had brought them to this desolate place on this night of all nights. Leading the group, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, was Dr. Emily Carter, a renowned paranormal investigator. Her years spent researching the unexplained had led her to this, the pinnacle of haunted locations. Beside her sat Jake Turner, a skeptical journalist, invited along to document the events and perhaps debunk the myths surrounding Blackwood Manor. In the back, their faces a mixture of excitement and apprehension, sat the final 2 members of their group. First, there was Liam O'Connell, a psychic medium, his piercing gaze seemingly focused on something beyond the realm of the tangible. Finally, there was Sarah Walker, a history enthusiast and amateur photographer, her camera bag clutched protectively on her lap. The van lurched to a halt in front of the dilapidated portico. Silence descended, heavier than the storm raging around them. It was the silence of anticipation, the stillness before the storm, pregnant with unspoken fear. For a moment, no one moved. They sat in the suffocating darkness, the only sound their own ragged breathing. Then Emily broke the silence, her voice a calm counterpoint to the raging storm outside. "This is it," she said, her eyes alight with a mixture of trepidation and excitement. "This is Blackwood Manor." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. They had arrived at their destination. The game, it seemed, was about to begin. Stepping out of the van, the group was immediately assaulted by the full force of the storm. The wind tore at their clothes, the rain stinging their faces like 1,000 tiny needles. Above them, the manor loomed, its silhouette a menacing shadow against the tempestuous sky. They huddled together, a small island of humanity in a sea of raging elements. Emily, her face illuminated by a flashlight beam, led the way towards the imposing oak doors. Each step felt heavy, as if they were wading through an invisible force field of fear and anticipation. As they approached the entrance, a sudden gust of wind slammed the doors shut with a resounding boom that echoed through the night. A collective gasp escaped the group. Even Jake, the skeptic, felt a shiver run down his spine. The sound, so unexpected, so primal, seemed to hang in the air, a tangible manifestation of the oppressive atmosphere that surrounded it. It was as if the manor itself was issuing a warning. Emily turned to face the group, her expression a mixture of determination and apprehension. "Don't let it unnerve you," she said, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "It's just the wind." But even as she spoke, her words lacked conviction. Liam, his eyes closed, inhaled deeply, his senses attuned to the unseen world around them. "There's something here," he whispered, his voice barely a murmur. "Something dark." His words, spoken with such conviction, sent a fresh wave of unease through the group. Sarah, her camera already raised, snapped a picture of the imposing facade. "Let's just hope it's camera-friendly," she said, attempting a nervous laugh that died in her throat. Even in her fear, the photographer in her couldn't resist documenting the macabre beauty of their surroundings. Jake, ever the pragmatist, pulled his collar up against the biting wind. "Let's just get inside, shall we?" he said, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness he couldn't quite conceal. "I, for one, would prefer to be scared out of my wits in the dry." With renewed determination, Emily stepped forward and grasped the heavy iron door knocker. The metal felt cold and oddly damp beneath her touch. She rapped 3 times, the sound echoing through the silence like a death knell. They waited, their breath catching in their throats, but there was no answer. The silence stretched, each second an eternity, amplifying their fear. Just when their nerves were stretched to breaking point, they heard it. A faint sound from within, a scraping noise followed by the unmistakable click of a lock disengaging. Someone, or something, was waiting for them on the other side. The heavy oak door creaked open slowly, revealing a shadowy figure silhouetted against the flickering light of a single candle. The figure, shrouded in darkness, beckoned them forward with a gnarled hand. A cold draught of air, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay, seeped out from the darkness within, sending a shiver down their spines. For a moment no one dared to move. They stood frozen on the threshold, caught between the fury of the storm and the unknown terrors that awaited them within. The figure in the doorway remained motionless, their features obscured by the shadows, their silence more unnerving than any scream. Then Emily, her heart pounding in her chest, took a tentative step forward. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing in the cavernous space beyond. "Is anyone there?" Section 8. Ticking clock. Mounting dread. The figure remained silent, their only response a slow, deliberate nod. Taking a deep breath, Emily motioned for the others to follow her. One by one they stepped across the threshold, leaving behind the relative safety of the storm-ravaged night and entering the oppressive darkness of Blackwood Manor. As soon as the last of them crossed the threshold, the heavy oak door slammed shut with a resounding boom. The sound reverberated through the manor, shaking the very foundations of the ancient building. They were trapped, their fate sealed. The game had begun. The clock was ticking, and in the haunted halls of Blackwood Manor, terror awaited. Section 1. The heart of the labyrinth. The air inside Blackwood Manor was thick with the scent of decay and dust, heavy with the weight of ages past. Cobwebs, spun into intricate tapestries by unseen spiders, draped the high ceilings and adorned the once grand chandeliers, now dark and lifeless. The single flickering candle held by the figure in the doorway did little to penetrate the oppressive gloom, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted and writhed on the walls like living things. Emily, her eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light, took in their surroundings. They stood in a grand entrance hall, its former glory now faded and forgotten. A sweeping staircase, its once polished banister now covered in a thick layer of dust, dominated the far end of the hall. Portraits of stern-faced individuals, their eyes seeming to follow the group's every move, lined the walls, their presence adding to the unsettling atmosphere. "Where are we?" whispered Sarah, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her own heart. The silence that followed her question was heavier than the darkness that surrounded them, filled with unspoken fears and the weight of the unknown. Section 2. Whispers of the Past. The figure in the doorway, their features still obscured by the shadows, turned and gestured silently for them to follow. As they moved deeper into the manor, the wind howled outside, its mournful cries seeming to echo through the empty halls like the lamentations of the dead. Each footstep on the cold stone floor echoed through the silence, amplifying the sense of their isolation. They passed through a series of interconnected rooms, each one grander yet more decayed than the last. Faded tapestries, depicting scenes of hunts and battles long past, hung limply on the walls, their colours bleached by time and neglect. Furniture, once luxurious but now rotting and infested with vermin, lay scattered as if frozen in time, remnants of a life long gone. Liam, his senses heightened, felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "There's so much sadness here," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "So much pain." His words hung in the air, a stark reminder that they were not alone within the walls of Blackwood Manor. Emily, her gaze sweeping over their surroundings, noticed something glinting in the dim light. She moved closer, her flashlight beam illuminating a small silver picture frame lying overturned on the floor. Bending down, she carefully picked it up, brushing away the dust to reveal a photograph of a young woman with hauntingly sad eyes. The woman in the photograph was beautiful, with long flowing hair and a delicate bone structure. But it was her eyes that held Emily captive. They were filled with a deep, unyielding sadness, a sense of longing that seemed to reach out from the photograph and touch Emily's soul. "Who is she?" asked Sarah, her voice hushed as she peered over Emily's shoulder. "She looks so familiar, but I can't quite place her." "I don't know," replied Emily, her gaze still fixed on the photograph. "But I have a feeling we're going to find out." As she spoke, she felt a cold draft brush past her, raising goosebumps on her arms. It was as if someone or something was standing right beside her, their presence unseen but undeniably felt. The figure in the doorway, who had been waiting patiently in the shadows, cleared their throat, their voice a dry rasp that startled the group. "Come," the figure beckoned, their voice barely a whisper. "There is much to be shown." With that, they turned and continued their journey deeper into the heart of the manor. As they followed, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The eyes of the portraits lining the walls seemed to follow their every move, and the shadows themselves seemed to twist and writhe, as if alive, their movements just beyond the periphery of her vision. The air grew colder as they descended a flight of creaking stairs, the musty scent of decay intensifying with each step. The lower levels of the manor were shrouded in an almost tangible darkness, the feeble light of the candles struggling to penetrate the gloom. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine, a primal fear gripping her heart. "I don't like this," she whispered to Jake, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her own heart. "This place, it feels wrong." Jake, ever the skeptic, tried to make light of her fears. "It's just an old house, Em," he said, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness he couldn't quite conceal. "There's nothing to be afraid of." But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The figure in the doorway stopped at the end of the hallway, their shadows stretching out before them like a dark premonition. They turned to face the group, their features still obscured by the shadows, and gestured towards a set of heavy, iron-wrought doors. The doors were ornately carved with grotesque figures and scenes of torment, their very presence radiating an aura of menace. A low, mournful, howling sound, like the cry of a wounded animal, echoed through the hallway, seemingly emanating from behind the doors. Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine as the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The sound cut through her, chilling her to the bone. "What is that sound?" whispered Sarah, her voice trembling. "It sounds like someone is hurting." "This is where she resides," the figure in the doorway rasped, their voice barely audible above the mournful howling. "The Lady of the Manor!" With that, they reached out a trembling hand and slowly pushed the heavy doors open. The doors groaned in protest, their rusted hinges screaming like tortured souls. As the doors creaked open, a musty odour, thick with the scent of decay and something akin to burnt lavender, wafted out, assaulting their senses. The flickering candlelight revealed a spacious drawing room, frozen in time. Dust-covered furniture, draped in faded velvet and cobwebs, sat in the centre of the room, illuminated by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through a single cracked window. A grand piano, its keys yellowed with age, sat silent against one wall, while a fireplace, cold and empty, dominated the other. The room was eerily still, yet a palpable sense of sadness and loss hung heavy in the air. In a high-backed armchair near the fireplace sat a figure, their back to the group, seemingly oblivious to their presence. They were draped in what appeared to be a long, flowing gown, their long white hair cascading down their back like a waterfall. The figure remained perfectly still, as though lost in thought or perhaps asleep. "Who is that?" whispered Liam, his voice barely audible. He stepped cautiously into the room, his gaze fixed on the figure in the chair. The others followed tentatively, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. As they drew closer, Emily noticed a small silver picture frame lying on a table beside the figure. The frame was identical to the one she had found earlier, the one containing the photograph of the sad-eyed woman. A sense of dread began to creep into her heart. Emily reached out and gently touched the figure's shoulder. "Excuse me," she said softly. "We don't mean to intrude, but—" Her words were cut short as the figure slowly turned to face them. The woman in the chair was the spitting image of the woman in the photograph, her features etched with the same haunting sadness, her eyes reflecting a depth of sorrow that sent chills down Emily's spine. But it was her face that truly horrified them. Her skin was stretched taut across her skull, as pale and lifeless as parchment. Her eyes, once filled with sadness, now burned with an eerie, unnatural light. And her lips, once full and inviting, were drawn back in a grotesque grin that revealed a row of sharp, pointed teeth. A blood-curdling scream tore through the silence as Sarah stumbled backward, dropping her camera in fright. The candle held by the figure in the doorway flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through the group as they stumbled blindly, their screams echoing through the empty manor. "The switchboard! Find the switchboard!" Emily yelled, her voice lost in the chaos. Then silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that was more terrifying than any scream, and in the darkness they could hear the sound of their own hearts pounding in their chests, each beat a terrifying reminder that they were trapped, alone, with whatever evil lurked within the walls of Blackwood Manor. A suffocating darkness pressed in on them, thick and heavy, amplifying every rustle and creak of the old house. Emily, her heart pounding against her ribs, fumbled in her pocket for her lighter. A small flame sputtered to life, a beacon of fragile hope in the overwhelming darkness. The shadows danced and recoiled, revealing the terrified faces of her companions. Liam, his eyes wide with a primal fear that transcended even his psychic abilities, huddled close to Sarah. Her camera, forgotten on the floor, reflected the flickering flame, a single eye staring back from the abyss. Jake, his usual skepticism replaced by a raw terror, stood frozen, his gaze darting around the room as if expecting the darkness itself to reach out and claim him. The woman in the chair, the lady of the manor, was gone. The only evidence of her presence was the lingering scent of decay and lavender, a cloying perfume that spoke of death and something ancient, something unholy. The silence, broken only by their ragged breaths, was deafening, heavy with anticipation and dread. "The switchboard," Emily repeated, her voice shaking slightly despite her attempt at a calm facade. "There has to be a switchboard somewhere in this house." She knew that finding a light source, however insignificant, was their only hope of regaining a semblance of control over the situation, over their fear. They moved cautiously through the darkness, guided by Emily's wavering flame. Each step was fraught with terror, the fear of the unknown amplified by the suffocating blackness that surrounded them. The air was thick with the dust of ages, the silence punctuated by the creaking of floorboards beneath their feet and the pounding of their own hearts. Liam, his senses overwhelmed, stumbled over an unseen object. A muffled curse escaped his lips as he fell, his hand connecting with something cold and metallic. "I found something," he whispered, his voice tight with apprehension. "I think it's a candlestick." Emily knelt beside him, her lighter illuminating a heavy, ornate candlestick lying on the floor. It was cold to the touch, the metal smooth and worn from years of handling. Carefully she retrieved a lighter from her backpack and lit the single wick. The flame, small but steady, pushed back the darkness, casting flickering shadows that danced and swayed on the walls. With the candlestick held high, they continued their search for the switchboard. The drawing room, now dimly lit, seemed less menacing, the shadows retreating to the corners. The furniture, draped in dust covers, loomed like ghostly sentinels, their presence a stark reminder of a life long gone. "This house," whispered Sarah, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the flame. "It's like time has stood still here." There was a sense of melancholy in her voice, a recognition of the tragedy that seemed to permeate every inch of Blackwood Manor. Jake, his gaze fixed on the doorway through which they had entered, let out a startled gasp. "Where did he go?" he exclaimed, his voice edged with panic. "The caretaker, the one with the candle. He was just here." Emily turned, her heart sinking as she realized the truth of his words. The figure who had led them into the drawing room, the silent guide who had seen more shadow than substance, was gone. The doorway stood empty, the darkness beyond seemingly deeper, more impenetrable than before. "We're on our own," whispered Liam, his voice heavy with foreboding. "We've been abandoned." His words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of their isolation within the walls of Blackwood Manor. The house, it seemed, was playing its own game, toying with them, isolating them, driving them deeper into fear. Emily, determined to find the switchboard and break free from the oppressive darkness, led the way out of the drawing room and into the adjoining hallway. The candlestick cast long, dancing shadows that stretched and contorted on the walls, taking on monstrous shapes in their imaginations. The air was heavy with the weight of secrets, the silence broken only by the creaking of the old house and the sound of their own footsteps. As they rounded a corner, Emily noticed a portrait hanging on the wall, its gilded frame slightly askew. The portrait, rendered in stark black and white, depicted a young woman with hauntingly familiar, sad eyes. It was the same woman from the photograph, her beauty marred by an air of profound melancholy. "It's her," whispered Sarah, her voice hushed with a mixture of fascination and dread. "The woman from the photograph." Emily, drawn to the portrait as if by an unseen force, stepped closer. The woman's eyes seemed to follow her every move, her gaze filled with an unspoken plea. Reaching out, Emily traced the outline of the woman's face with her fingertip. The canvas felt surprisingly cold beneath her touch, as if a current of icy air had swept through the room. As she did so, she noticed something peculiar. The wall behind the portrait felt strangely loose, as if it were not solid brick and mortar. With a surge of adrenaline, she pushed against the wall, her fingers finding a hidden latch concealed beneath the edge of the frame. A clicking sound echoed through the hallway as the wall swung inward, revealing a small hidden chamber. "What is this place?" whispered Jake, his voice a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as he peered into the darkness beyond. The air within the chamber was stale and musty, thick with the scent of decay and forgotten things. Emily, her curiosity overriding her fear, stepped into the hidden chamber. The candlestick illuminated a cramped space barely large enough to stand in. The walls were lined with shelves, stacked high with dusty books and leather-bound journals. A small wooden desk sat against the far wall, its surface covered in papers and writing implements. It was a secret study, hidden away from prying eyes. As Emily's gaze swept over the room, it landed on a name etched into the leather cover of one of the journals. The name, written in elegant cursive script, sent a shiver down her spine. It was the name she had seen in the guest book, the name that had echoed in her dreams. "Eleanor Blackwood," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Liam, his psychic senses overwhelmed by the palpable sadness and despair that permeated the hidden chamber, swayed slightly. "There's so much pain here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "So much regret." He reached out a hand towards the desk, his fingertips brushing against a stack of yellowed letters bound together with a faded ribbon. As he lifted the letters, a photograph slipped loose, fluttering to the floor at his feet. It was a photograph of Eleanor Blackwood, the woman from the portrait, her sad eyes gazing out at the camera. But this time, she wasn't alone. Standing beside her, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist, was a tall, handsome man with piercing blue eyes and a mischievous smile. There was an undeniable air of sadness about him, a sense of longing that mirrored Eleanor's own melancholy. "Who is he?" asked Sarah, her voice hushed as she knelt beside Liam, her gaze fixed on the photograph. They looked so in love, yet so incredibly sad. As Sarah spoke, a cold breeze swept through the hidden chamber, extinguishing the candle flame and plunging them back into darkness. A blood-curdling scream, filled with an unimaginable anguish and despair, echoed through the manor, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The scream sent chills down their spines, rooting them to the spot in terror. Then silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that was broken only by the sound of their own ragged breaths and the pounding of their own hearts. Emily, fumbling for her lighter, finally managed to ignite a flame. As the darkness receded, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Scrawled across the wall of the hidden chamber, written in what appeared to be dried blood, was a single sentence. The words, written in a frantic hand, sent a shiver down her spine. Forever bound by blood and betrayal, she read aloud, her voice trembling. Their love, a curse upon this house. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Emily knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that they had stumbled upon the heart of the mystery, the source of the darkness that clung to Blackwood Manor. Emily stared at the blood-chilling inscription, a cold dread seeping into her bones. The sentence, etched in blood and despair, echoed the torment that clung to Blackwood Manor. Eleanor Blackwood and her mysterious lover, bound by a love twisted into a curse. To survive the night, they needed to understand this tragic love and the betrayal that fueled the curse. "We need to find out who he was," Emily said, her voice firm. "Eleanor's lover. He holds the key to understanding this curse." Guided by a shared sense of urgency, they carefully gathered the letters and the scattered photographs, treating each piece of the past with reverence. The air crackled with unseen energy, as if the spirits of Blackwood Manor watched their every move, their presence both a threat and a guide. With a shared resolve, they decided to seek refuge in the room they'd discovered behind the portrait, the secret study where Eleanor Blackwood had poured her heart onto the pages of her journals. Stepping back into the hallway, Emily noticed a faint glow emanating from beneath a heavy wooden door at the far end. The door, unlike the others they had encountered, was not locked or even latched. It stood slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. A musty odour, a combination of old paper and decaying leather, wafted from the room beyond, promising knowledge and perhaps danger. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice a mix of apprehension and fascination. The glow from within pulsed faintly, beckoning them closer. Emily, her hand hovering over the tarnished doorknob, felt a tremor of unease. The house seemed to breathe around them, each creak and groan a whispered warning. "Only one way to find out," she murmured, pushing the door open with a slow, deliberate movement. The room they discovered was unlike any they could have imagined. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, crammed with ancient tomes bound in leather and velvet. A massive mahogany desk, its surface littered with open books and scattered quills, dominated the centre of the room. A single flickering gas lamp cast long, dancing shadows across the shelves, illuminating faded titles and intricate gold lettering. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and leather, a testament to centuries of accumulated knowledge and whispered secrets. "A library," breathed Jake, his gaze sweeping over the endless rows of books. Even his usual cynicism seemed to fade in the face of such a vast collection of knowledge. But why hidden away like this? Liam, his gaze drawn to a particularly ornate volume lying open on the desk, ran his fingers lightly over its aged leather cover. "This house," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the gas lamp. "It's more than just a place. It's a repository of memories, of emotions. Every generation that lived and died within these walls, their joys, their sorrows, it's all here, etched into the very fabric of this place." He carefully lifted the book, its pages brittle with age. The script, written in a flowing hand, was unfamiliar yet strangely compelling. "These are Eleanor's diaries," he whispered, his voice filled with awe, her most private thoughts, her hopes, her fears. "They might hold the answers we seek." Emily, her gaze drawn to a faded inscription on the inside cover of the diary, felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't alone, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Eleanor. She shared her secrets with someone. The inscription, written in a hand that differed from Eleanor's elegant script, was bolder, more passionate. "My dearest Eleanor," it read, the ink faded but the words still imbued with a lingering tenderness. "May these pages forever hold the testament of our love, a love that will never die, even within these cursed walls." It was signed simply, Daniel. The name, spoken aloud for the first time in over a century, seemed to hang in the air, a tangible presence in the silent library. Daniel. Eleanor's forbidden love, the man whose image haunted the photographs, whose sorrow resonated through the very foundation of Blackwood Manor. "Daniel," repeated Sarah, her voice hushed with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. "Who was he, Emily? What happened between them?" Emily, her fingers carefully turning the brittle pages of Eleanor's diary, felt a growing sense of dread. The entries, filled with passionate declarations of love and stolen moments, painted a picture of a love forbidden, a love destined for tragedy. Eleanor, trapped in a loveless marriage to a cruel and powerful man, had found solace in the arms of Daniel, a young artist who saw beyond her social standing and into her heart. But their happiness was short-lived. As Emily delved deeper into the diary, the tone shifted, the entries becoming filled with a growing despair, a sense of impending doom. Eleanor wrote of whispers and accusations, of a growing rift between Daniel and her husband. Then, in a heart-wrenching entry, the truth was revealed. "Daniel betrayed me," Eleanor had written, her words a mix of anguish and disbelief. "He swore his love for me, yet he conspired with my husband, plotting to steal my inheritance and leave me with nothing." A cold fury emanated from Liam, his eyes flashing with anger. "That deceitful—" he began, his voice tight with rage, his hands clenching into fists. "He toyed with her affections, used her love for his own selfish gain." "But why?" Sarah interrupted, her voice a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Why would he pretend to love her, only to betray her trust so completely?" Before Emily could answer, a low, guttural growl echoed from the depths of the manor. The sound, primal and filled with an unspeakable rage, sent a fresh wave of terror through the group. The hairs on the back of their necks stood on end, their instincts screaming at them to run, to escape the encroaching darkness. "We're running out of time," Jake whispered, his voice tight with fear. "We need to find a way out of here, and fast." Suddenly a memory flickered in Emily's mind, a line from Eleanor's diary scrawled in a shaky hand. "He seeks to bind me, body and soul," Eleanor had written. "He plans to use the old magic, the ritual of binding, to trap me here forever." Emily's blood ran cold. The ritual of binding, an ancient and forbidden magic, whispered about in hushed tones but rarely spoken of directly. It was said to require a blood sacrifice, a life offered in exchange for power over another. "We need to find the ritual chamber," Emily said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. "If we can disrupt the ritual, break the binding, we might be able to free Eleanor and end this curse." Following their instincts, guided by the growing sense of dread that permeated the manor, they descended deeper into the bowels of the house. The air grew colder, thicker, as if they were descending into the very heart of the earth. The scent of decay intensified, mingled with something ancient and unholy, something that spoke of blood and sacrifice. The hallway opened into a large circular chamber. A single flickering torch illuminated the space, revealing stone walls adorned with strange symbols and runes. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, stained a dark, rusty brown. A chill wind swept through the room, carrying with it the whispers of countless tormented souls. "This is it," whispered Liam, his voice barely audible above the pounding of his own heart. "This is where it happened, where Eleanor was betrayed, where her life was taken." As the group cautiously approached the altar, a figure began to materialize before them. The air shimmered, coalescing into the form of a man, his features obscured by the flickering torchlight. He was tall and imposing, his presence radiating an aura of power and menace. "You dare trespass in my domain?" the figure boomed, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You dare interfere with matters that are beyond your comprehension?" Emily, her heart pounding in her chest, stood her ground. "We know your secret, Daniel," she said, her voice trembling slightly, despite her attempt at a brave facade. "We know what you did to Eleanor." The figure let out a low chuckle that echoed through the chamber, a chilling sound that sent shivers down their spines. "Daniel?" he repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "That naive fool? He was nothing but a pawn in my game." The figure stepped into the torchlight, his features coming into sharp focus. It was the man from the photograph, Eleanor's supposed love. But time had not been kind. His face, once handsome, was now gaunt and twisted, his eyes burning with an unholy light. "I am Lucian," he proclaimed, his voice resonating with power, "Eleanor's husband, and this house, this cursed place, is mine." He gestured around the chamber, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of triumph and torment. "Bound to me just as she was." "You killed her," Emily whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. "You murdered your own wife and trapped her spirit here." Lucian's laughter echoed through the chamber, a chilling sound that sent shivers down their spines. "Love?" he spat, his voice laced with venom. "That pathetic fool Daniel thought he could steal her from me, win her love with his paltry charms and empty promises. But Eleanor, she was mine, always mine. Her inheritance, her very soul, belonged to me." He ran a hand over the blood-stained altar, his touch lingering on the dark stains. "She threatened to expose me, to reveal my schemes," he continued, his voice taking on a detached, almost wistful tone. "So I gave her a choice. Stay with me, bound by law and duty, or face the consequences." A flicker of something akin to pain crossed his features, quickly replaced by a chilling indifference. "She chose you," whispered Sarah, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the torch. "She chose love over freedom." She chose defiance, Lucian corrected, his voice hardening. She thought she could escape me, flee with that penniless artist. She underestimated my reach, my power. He turned his gaze on Emily, his eyes burning with an eerie intensity. This house, you see, is built on ancient grounds, a place of power where the veil between worlds is thin. He gestured towards the runes etched into the chamber walls. I made a pact, a bargain with forces beyond your understanding, he explained, his voice low and menacing. In exchange for my soul, for her eternal torment, I gained dominion over this place, the power to bind her spirit to mine for all eternity. But why? Jake asked, his voice a mix of horror and disbelief. Why go to such lengths? Why not simply let her go? Let her go! Lucian roared, his voice echoing through the chamber, his composure cracking for the first time. She was mine, my wife, my possession. I would see her soul damned for eternity before I would let her go. He slammed his fist against the stone altar, the impact reverberating through the chamber. The torchlight flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed on the chamber walls. A cold wind swept through the room, carrying with it the scent of decay and something infinitely more sinister. The air crackled with unseen energy, a palpable sense of rage and despair that sent chills down their spines. As the torchlight stabilized, they saw her, a shimmering figure, translucent yet undeniably present, materialized beside Lucian. It was Eleanor, her spectral form radiating a cold white light. Her eyes, once filled with sadness, now blazed with an icy fury, her gaze fixed on her tormentor. You broke your vows, Lucian, Eleanor said, her voice a mournful whisper that seemed to seep into their very bones. You betrayed my love, twisted it into something monstrous. She turned her gaze on the group, her expression softening slightly. You seek to understand the darkness that clings to this place. Look no further than the man beside me. He is the architect of his own torment, the author of his own despair. Lucian lunged for her, his hands outstretched, but his fingers passed through her spectral form. Silence, you ungrateful wretch! He roared, his voice raw with fury and pain. You are bound to me, remember. Your soul, your very essence is mine. No, Lucian, Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength, her form solidifying with each word. I am bound to this place because of your actions, yes, but I am not your prisoner. I am the warden of your torment, the keeper of your guilt. The air crackled with tension as Eleanor turned her gaze back to the group, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. You have a choice to make, she said, her voice echoing through the chamber. Help me break the chains of this curse or become another brick in the walls of his making. She gestured towards the runes etched into the chamber walls. The ritual can be undone, but it requires a sacrifice. Liam, his gaze darting between Eleanor and the menacing runes, took a step forward. What kind of sacrifice? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. Eleanor's gaze locked with his, her expression a mixture of sorrow and resolve. The chains of the curse are forged in blood and betrayal, she said, her voice echoing with the weight of ages. Only a sacrifice of equal measure can break them. Emily, her mind racing, suddenly understood. The curse wasn't just about Lucian's betrayal of Eleanor's love. It was about the betrayal of trust, the violation of a sacred bond. To break the curse, they needed to force Lucian to confront the consequences of his actions, to experience the same pain and loss he had inflicted on Eleanor. Lucian, Emily said, her voice trembling slightly despite her attempt at a brave facade. You said Eleanor chose defiance, but she wasn't defying you. She was defying the chains you sought to bind her with. the chains of possession, of control. She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. She chose love, yes, but she also chose freedom. And you, in your greed and your rage, you denied her both. Lucian, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and fear, lunged for Emily. "Silence!" he roared, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You know nothing of love, nothing of the pain of betrayal." But as he reached for her, Eleanor moved with a speed that defied comprehension. She stepped between them, her spectral form solidifying, becoming as real and as solid as any living being. She raised her hand and the air crackled with unseen energy. Lucian froze, his body rigid, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. "You are right, Lucian," Eleanor said, her voice filled with a terrible sadness. "I did choose love. And in doing so, I also chose to forgive. Not for you, but for myself, to break free from the chains of your hatred, your need for control." She turned her gaze to Emily, a sad smile gracing her lips. "Thank you," she whispered. "You helped me find peace." And with a final heart-wrenching cry, Eleanor threw her arms around Lucian, pulling him close. The air exploded with a blinding white light, the force of the blast throwing the others back against the chamber walls. Then silence. The echoing silence pressed in, heavier than the darkness that had consumed the chamber moments before. Emily, her ears ringing, her vision blurred, slowly pushed herself up from the cold stone floor. A thin plume of smoke rose from the spot where Eleanor and Lucian had stood, the air thick with the scent of ozone and something akin to burnt lavender. The torch on the wall sputtered back to life, casting a dim, flickering light that revealed the chamber, empty yet forever changed. Liam and Sarah, their faces pale and drawn, stumbled to their feet, their gazes darting around the room as if expecting another attack, another manifestation of the supernatural forces they had encountered. Jake, his usual skepticism shattered, simply stared at the empty space where Lucian had stood, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. "What happened?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her own heart. "Where did they go?" Emily, still shaken but feeling a strange sense of peace settle over her, slowly shook her head. "It's over," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. "The curse, it's broken." She looked at the empty space where Eleanor and Lucian had embraced, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "She chose to forgive him," Liam said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. Even in death, her love for him, however twisted, remained. And in forgiving him, in releasing him from his own hatred, she found her own peace. Jake, his skepticism slowly returning, ran a hand through his hair, his face a mask of confusion. But how? Why? He murdered her, trapped her spirit here for centuries. How could she possibly forgive him? Emily, drawing on her years of studying the paranormal, her encounters with the echoes of tormented souls, offered a sad smile. "Sometimes," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "the greatest act of love is letting go." Eleanor, in embracing Lucian at the moment of his greatest fear, his moment of reckoning, allowed him to finally confront the consequences of his actions. It wasn't about condoning what he did, but about breaking the cycle of hatred, of freeing them both from the prison he had created. A faint light, pale and ethereal, began to filter through the cracks in the chamber walls. Dawn was approaching, bringing with it the promise of a new day, a fresh start. The shadows in the chamber seemed to recede, the air feeling lighter, cleaner, as if a weight had been lifted. The darkness, whispered Sarah, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and relief. "It's fading." They made their way out of the chamber, their footsteps echoing in the sudden silence of the house. Gone were the whispers and groans, the cold draughts and oppressive atmosphere. Blackwood Manor, though still imposing in the pale light of dawn, felt different. Emptied, perhaps, but not menacing. The house, like the spirits it had once held captive, was finally at peace. As they stepped out onto the dew-covered lawn, the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air fresh and invigorating. Blackwood Manor, silhouetted against the rising sun, looked almost peaceful, its dark windows reflecting the golden light like repentant eyes. "It's over," Liam said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and relief. "It's finally over." But even as he spoke, a faint whisper seemed to dance on the wind, a fleeting melody that sent shivers down their spines. It was a sound both mournful and hopeful, a bittersweet symphony that spoke of love lost and found, of forgiveness and the enduring power of the human spirit. Emily, her gaze fixed on the manor, thought she saw a flicker of movement in one of the upper windows, a fleeting glimpse of white, like a curtain billowing in the breeze. Or perhaps she allowed herself to believe it was Eleanor, finally free from her earthly bonds, bidding them farewell. "Goodbye, Eleanor," Emily whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "Rest in peace." Jake, ever the journalist, turned to Emily, his eyes alight with a burning question. "The inscription," he said eagerly, "forever bound by blood and betrayal." Emily, her gaze fixed on the manor, shook her head slowly. "Some secrets," she whispered, "are better left buried." She turned and walked toward the waiting van, their footsteps silent on the dew-covered grass. Section 7. The Weight of Memory. As they drove away from Blackwood Manor, the sun rising higher in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched out behind them like fading memories, a heavy silence settled over the group. The events of the night, the terror, the revelations, the overwhelming sense of sorrow and loss pressed in on them, a shared burden that words couldn't quite express. Liam, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, his brow furrowed in thought, finally broke the silence. "Do you think they're truly at peace now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eleanor, Daniel, even Lucian. Sarah, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if to ward off a chill that went beyond the morning air, nodded slowly. "I want to believe so," she said, her voice tight with unshed tears. They deserved peace after all they'd been through. Section 8. Moving on. Emily, her gaze drifting to the rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of the manor disappearing in the distance, offered a small, sad smile. Their story is a reminder that even in the darkest of places, there is always hope. She turned her attention back to the road ahead, the rising sun painting the world in hues of hope and renewal. It's time to move on. Section 9. The Lingering Question. The drive back to civilization was a blur, the silence punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the occasional sigh or sniffle. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts, replaying the events of the night, grappling with the emotional turmoil that lingered long after the terror had subsided. As they approached the outskirts of town, the first signs of life, a lone gas station bathed in the warm glow of fluorescent lights. A dog walker strolling down the sidewalk brought with them a sense of normalcy, a stark contrast to the surreal and terrifying world they had just left behind. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper as she looked at Emily, her eyes searching for answers, for reassurance. "What do we do with what we saw, what we experienced?" Section 10, Blackwood's Shadow. Emily, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, offered a small, tired smile. "We remember Eleanor and Lucian, their love, their pain. We remember the darkness and the power of forgiveness. We carry their story with us, a reminder that dawn will always come." The van pulled back onto the highway, the rising sun painting the road ahead in a golden light. Blackwood Manor receded into the distance, a fading